So Joe talked about he mentioned the ISV statement of faith, or what we call the boundary stones. And rather than go down the whole list and just read the whole thing and get into all the nitty gritty, I wanted to talk about what to me is the most important aspect of the whole thing. And when we talk about boundaries, there's boundaries of belief, there's boundaries of doctrine. There's certain things where if you're going to have a cohesive group, we need to agree on certain things that glue us together. But there's also interpersonal boundaries between people, between individuals, between families. And in order for a community to have a cohesiveness, we have to be able to navigate the interpersonal stuff so that we can also navigate the doctrinal stuff. It's a package deal. And so part of the ISV boundary stones is basically our statement of beliefs. You know, we're Sabbath keepers, we eat clean, things like this. There's language in there about what we're going to focus on during services and what we're not going to focus on during services. But then there's also language on how we're going to talk to each other when things happen. Matthew 18 is the primary scripture that people go to when we talk about this, and we're going to be there today, but we're also going to give some examples. Basically, it's two parts. We're basically starting off talking about, because when you get into Matthew 18, a lot of translations will say, if your brother offends you. Well, offending means something today in 2025 America that it didn't mean when that was written. Like, we live in a culture of offense. Everybody's offended all the time by something. It's politics, it's just so-and-so looked at me wrong, and they're judging me by how I chew my food, and they hate me, and like all this, we get all worked up over the dumbest stuff. And so the first part of this is going to be talking about the easy stuff, which is that stuff. And then we're going to get into Matthew 18, if your brother sins. That's the more accurate interpretation. If your brother actually does something wrong, regardless of if your feelings are hurt or not, in Matthew 18, we're talking about actual wrongdoing, actual harm. So we're going to talk in two stages about that. So first off, let's go to Leviticus 19:17. This is the chapter where the second great command is found. Love your neighbor as yourself. Leviticus 19:17. This is going to set the tone for everything we're going to talk about. Leviticus 19:17. You shall not hate your fellow countrymen in your heart. If we could just stop right there. And Hebraically, I'm not a Hebrew. I'm an American. I can't think like a Hebrew would have thought 2,000 years ago, as much as I try. Can't do it. But as I understand it in the Hebrew, hate didn't mean what to them what it means for us now. It has to do with showing partiality, loving less. So like Jacob was loved, Esau was hated. It doesn't mean that Yahweh was up there just, that Esau, I can't stand him. No, he just didn't love him as much as he loved Esau. It's simpler than we tend to make it. So you shall not hate your fellow countrymen in your heart. You may surely reprove your neighbor. Some translations will say rebuke. Rebuke has a lot more oomph behind it. Like, nobody wants to be rebuked. Nobody wants to be someone who rebukes somebody because it sounds really harsh. But we have tons of scripture that tell us to do just that. But the first part here, I think, is the important part. You shall not hate your fellow countrymen in your heart. So you got to go into this process from the right framework. Your heart has to be right. And Yahshua talks about this a lot. This whole idea of if you hate your brother, you've committed a murder already. These kinds of things. If you go to the altar and you haven't reconciled with your brother, go reconcile with your brother first. These are heart issues that we have to get ourselves, we have to get together with and get ourselves right in these ways before we can do the other stuff. Because the heart is always going to be the weightier thing. So he wants us to not hate our fellow countrymen. Then we may reprove our neighbor. Why? But you shall not incur sin because of him. So if your neighbor is sinning, you are allowed to go and reprove them and say, hey, brother, what you're doing is wrong. But you're not allowed to hate him or show a lack of love towards him. So if we think about, has anyone, probably most people have thought about the idea that sin is kind of like a cancer. right? We see it individually. One sin leads to another sin. Like it's not apples to apples, but there's an old VeggieTales story of I forget what they called it, the fib monster or something like that. Is that what it was? Yeah, okay. So it starts off this little thing and it grows into this big, huge monster. And sin is like that. Sin is like that individually, internally. You start off like, oh, I'll just do it just this once. And then that just this once turns into just this twice. And next thing you know, you've established a pattern of destructive behavior that's not just affecting you, it's affecting the people around you that you love. And so if we think of it in terms of a parasite or in terms of cancer, you just can't let that go on or the body will be destroyed. So Yahweh is giving us the tools we need to be able to stop things before they get started. But we have to have the heart to actually do it properly, because when we go to someone and say, hey, what you're doing is wrong, we can come at them with accusation and judgment and condemnation, which is what we tend to do if we do it at all. It's 2025. We typically don't confront each other anymore. We're too polite. Or, we underplay it. We're like, oh, well, and we're not firm enough. So we're going to talk today about how to kind of find that balance. So if we talk about offense, and we talk about offenses in terms of hurt feelings, there's a lot of married couples in the room. Now, if you've had an argument or a dispute with your spouse, and you're both all worked up, and I can't believe that person, and then you kind of settle down, and maybe a day or two, maybe a week later, you finally really talk about it, and then you find out that it was a misunderstanding. Has that happened to anybody? Married couples? Yeah? And you don't have to be married to know what that's like. It happens with friends, it happens with siblings, parents, children. I think more often than not, when we get offended in the terms of we get upset by something somebody said or did, whether it's right or wrong in terms of morality, whether we would call it sin, it's usually a misunderstanding. So before we even get to Matthew 18, we have a lot of work to do pre-Matthew 18, where we just learn to talk to each other as close as we can in real time. If we perceive that someone is upset with us, instead of just saying, well, why are they upset with me? I didn't do anything wrong. It doesn't matter. You're perceiving that a person is upset with you. So you can go to that person, you can say, hey, I don't know what's going on, but I'm picking up that you're upset with me. Did I do something or not do something? And then you've got a conversation. And then you can find out, well, maybe this person's right. Maybe I actually did do the wrong thing, or maybe I didn't do something I should have done. Or maybe it's a misunderstanding, because sometimes we hear things that people don't actually say. And so I think a lot of what we're dealing with when we talk about, personal issues, conflict between people, has to do with stuff that could just be worked out if we just stop what we're doing and just talk through it. So that's the easiest part of this to deal with. That's the least controversial thing, is just learning to talk to each other in real time. But we've been trained in America not to do that. We've got the pop culture saying, if you disagree with somebody, you hate them, And so it's to the point now to where we almost have to be brave and courageous to even talk to somebody about these kinds of things, It's one thing, your spouse, you have a relationship with your spouse, but the further out you get beyond the nuclear family, the more difficult it is to talk to somebody about this kind of stuff in real time. And hopefully we don't have many issues here within the camp, but we're going to have some issues. And I like to tell people, when I meet somebody for the first time, and I've noticed a pattern of their faces. When I say this, I'll be like, here's the deal. I'm going to offend you. I'm going to say something that's going to rub you raw or upset you. I'm a human being. You're a human being. It's going to happen. When that happens, I would like you to tell me. Let's talk through it. And every time I say that to somebody, I get the same look on their face, it's almost like shock. We shouldn't be shocked about something like that. That should be the norm. That's how messed up America is. That should be what we do by default. But to talk about it and suggest that we dare do that it's this foreign thing to us. And I would like to make it not foreign. I would like to make that as domestic as possible within the camp. That should be just bare bones. We all do it automatically. We do it in our sleep. If we're talking to each other in our sleep, then maybe we have some other issues to deal with. But anyway, so that's the easy part. I want to get into actual Matthew 18, okay? So let's go there real quick. Everybody knows Matthew 18. I've even heard people say, I'm going to Matthew 18 someone. Like it's a process with a name. And I'm basically, I thought about what to call this teaching, and I was going to call it How to Rebuke Your Neighbor. That just sounds a little too much. I don't know. So I'm just calling it Sin in the Camp. How do we deal with sin in the camp? You have to be able to talk through it. So Matthew 18, let's start reading in verse 15. We'll go through verse 20. Matthew 18, Matthew 18. Matthew 18, 15 through 20. If your brother sins, some translations will say transgresses. Some translations will say offends. I'm reading the New American Standard. Mine just says if your brother sins. Some translations will say if your brother sins against you. So either way, your brother is doing something wrong. They're trespassing, they're transgressing, they're crossing a boundary. And it can be in general or it can be against you specifically. Go and show him his fault in private. If he listens to you, you have won your brother. Now, the first thing to take note here, if you feel like your brother has sinned, if your brother hurt your feelings, if your brother may or may not, no, if your brother sins. So it's implied that by this point we have established that your brother has done something wrong. Maybe there was a witness. Of course, if it's one-on-one, it's somebody's word against yours. That's why we get more people involved here in a minute. But there's actual wrongdoing, and there's no debate at this point. It's like the woman caught in adultery. It says they caught her in the act. There's no debate. It happened. They should have brought the guy because they caught him in the act too. But there's no dispute. There was no investigation. Did this actually happen? No, they were caught in the act. So at this point, your brother has sinned. You know it. It's established fact. So you go to him in private, and I would say, or her, and you say, hey, here's the wrong thing that you did. Here's how you transgressed. And it can be something minor, all the way up to something major. We're going to read something major here in a minute. But I have some examples. But either way, the whole idea is, it's like, if I do something wrong, I'm either aware of it or I'm not. If I intentionally do something wrong that I know is going to harm somebody, or at least has the potential, that's one thing. If I do something wrong ignorantly, that's another thing. If I do something wrong intentionally, I run the risk of habitually doing that. Maybe I have a character flaw that's going to lead me to do the same sin over and over and over again. And if I'm left in the body with that unchecked, then we're dealing with cancer. Then we're dealing with something that's malignant. My sin has the possibility to spread and actually cause harm to the group. If we're dealing with somebody who did something ignorantly, we kind of have the same thing from a different angle. If somebody doesn't know they're doing something wrong, what's their motivation to change? They're just going to keep doing the same thing over and over again, just with an innocent heart. They're going to have no idea. It's just one is intentional, the other one is not. The end result is the same. Sin is spreading through the camp. And so when we go to each other, after we've identified that a wrong actually has happened, if the person did it ignorantly, then it should be fairly straightforward. Like, thanks for telling me. I didn't realize that was wrong. I won't do it again. Okay, that's great. That's best case scenario. Worst case scenario, the person did it intentionally. Then you've got to have that conversation. Well, why did you do that? If you knew that was wrong, why did you do? Then you've got a conversation that's deeper than just, hey, FYI, don't do that again. Now you've got to deal with heart issues. So who knows what this conversation is going to be like? It's going to be different for everybody. It's going to be different for every situation. But it's going to be a conversation. And if the person can figure out, okay, yeah, I I did that wrong intentionally, and talking to you, I can see that I shouldn't have done that. I was a jerk, whatever. And there's actual repentance, that's great. You've won your brother. Because now your brother, either way, your brother has knowledge that he didn't have before. He has a little bit more knowledge on what sin looks like, so he's better able to avoid it in the future, which is better for him and better for the group. If your brother sinned intentionally, he has an opportunity for repentance. And anytime we take an opportunity for repentance, that's always a good thing. That's how we grow. So that's the ideal. If he does not listen to you, verse 16, take one or two more with you, so that by the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses every fact may be confirmed. So this is where I think, and it doesn't say it in the text, if the person sins ignorantly, they're probably not going to make it to this step. This is most likely the person who sinned on purpose, who thinks that what they did was justified in some reason. Maybe their interpretation of Scripture is different. That happens sometimes, because sometimes we read their Scriptures and on the finer points of Torah keeping, we disagree. So one person will say, well, you're keeping that commandment wrong. No, you're keeping that commandment wrong. Maybe we're both keeping it wrong, right? We don't ever think about that option. Maybe we both are. But if this person won't listen to you privately, the idea is that by bringing more people in, I think it has a greater weight. Because if you just got one-on-one contact, there's still the possibility that there could be some kind of misunderstanding. Maybe there's some kind of personal history that clouds our vision and doesn't allow us to accept something that somebody says. But when you bring more people in, now all of a sudden the stakes are a little bit higher. And you've got more people saying, hey, what you did, Joe Bob, Billy Bob, was wrong. Here's why. And if we're learned enough in the Torah, we can actually open the book and say, here's what you did, and here's where Yahweh says we shouldn't do that. So we need you to reconcile with Billy Bob, Joe Bob, who is Joe Bob, Billy Bob's brother, and figure this out, reconcile, and don't do this thing again. Now we get to the point, if he refuses to listen to them, verse 17, tell it to the church or the assembly. Now we're like, okay, so now, and I think one of the reasons why we don't take this step is because we've been conditioned to think if we talk about somebody around other people, we're gossiping or we're slandering. You can't go through this process unless you talk through these things with other people. Just logically. If somebody is doing something that they shouldn't be doing, we have to be able to discuss it. Because how do you get counsel? How do you go to someone who's older and wiser than you and say, hey, here's a problem I'm dealing with, if you can't talk about the problem you're dealing with? And in certain situations, maybe you don't name the name, but in certain situations, I think you have to. I mean, when we read Paul's letters, Paul is naming names all the time. But he's doing it for a reason. Paul is naming names because he's saying, watch out for that person. That person has been addressed. That person has been told that what they're doing is wrong, and they're not repentant. So if you engage with that person, you run the risk of malignancy. You run the risk of that cancer spreading through the body. That person just needs to be out of here. And Paul does that routinely in his letters. Maybe not routinely, but he does it sometimes. So if he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the assembly. If he refuses to listen even to the assembly, the wider group, let him be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. That's pretty strong language when you understand how the Jews at that time thought about Gentiles and tax collectors. So when we read Romans 11, which we won't do, I think Joshua is talking about cut-off language here. And I would like to put together a teaching at some point in the next few months talking about what it means to be cut off. Because certain sins say, do this and you'll be dead. You'll be stoned to death, whatever. Some say you'll be cut off from your people. And a lot of people interpret being cut off from your people as being killed. Well, why not just say be killed and just be consistent with the language? Why do we have different language? I think this is someone being cut off from their people. Because this person has shown that they are going to keep on doing what has been confirmed to be sin. There's no dispute. At this point in the process, there's no dispute that the person did sin. We know they did. But they are not accepting that, and they are not repenting. So that says this person is going to keep doing behavior like this in the camp. This is going to spread. When one person sins and there's no accountability, it gives another person permission to do that same sin, because Joe Bob, Billy Bob got away with it, I can too. So this person has to be put out. And it's a shame that situations come to this, but they do. If you think about a Gentile, like I said, Romans 11, and other places in Paul, if you have come in and been made a part of Israel, you are in covenant, you worship the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, you're no longer a Gentile. You've been grafted into Israel. And if you think about the tax collectors at the time, these are people that were Jews who were collecting taxes from their countrymen on behalf of the Romans. That's why they were so hated. They were considered traitors. Well, if you, and you see this in The Chosen, I don't know if anyone's watched The Chosen, I know some of you guys have. Matthew, he's a tax collector, he's Jewish, everybody hates his guts. When he follows Messiah, he stops collecting taxes, because at that point, he can't do it anymore. He can't continue to function in an adversarial role to his own people while he's in the camp. That doesn't make sense. So a tax collector is going to be someone outside the camp by default. A Gentile is going to be somebody outside the camp by default. So he's talking about people that are not part of the camp. They're not part of the actual group. Now, can a Gentile be brought in the group? Yes. Paul talks about it. We see it in the Torah. Gentiles can be brought into Israel. Can a tax collector be brought into the group? Yes, they can. But while they're a Gentile, while they're a tax collector, they're not part of the group. That's why they're called Gentiles and tax collectors. So he's not saying that this person is permanently exiled, this person is shunned forever and they can never ever be. That's not what he's saying. He's saying while they're engaging in this unrepentant sin, they cannot be a part of the group, and it's for the greater good. When we go back to Leviticus 19, he tells us that he doesn't want sin in the camp. He doesn't want that. So we're supposed to be able to reprove each other, but without hatred in our heart. So that's kind of what he's getting at here, but let's keep going here. And this is where I'm going to give my interpretation of this, saying that I'm not dogmatic on it. I know that other people interpret this differently, but to me, when I read this in context, he's talking about, so when we get to 18, let's just read it. Truly I say to you, whatever you bind on earth shall have been bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth shall have been loosed in heaven. Again, I say to you that if two of you agree on earth about anything that you may ask, it shall be done for them by my Father who is in heaven. For where two or three have gathered together in my name, I am there in their midst. Now, I've always heard this interpreted that if we get together in a group that's got more than two or three people, whatever we pray for, because there's at least two or three of us, he's going to give it to us. How many people have been in a group of more than two or three and prayed for something and never got it? I don't think that's what this means. He just earlier talked about going to the person, taking two or three with you. He's talking about the assembly collectively deciding to remove this person. This is judgment. This is administerial judgment within a body. I think what he's talking about here is the decisions among the leadership in the group. And of course, in this case, he doesn't say go to the elders of the group. He says take it to the whole group. Take it to the whole assembly. I think what he's saying here is if you've gone through this process and you have decided that this person needs to be removed, and if you're doing it under his authority, in his name, that's the hard part to suss out here, because everybody's going to say, well, of course I'm doing it under his authority. Are we? I hope so. But we shouldn't be so quick to assume that we are. But if you are, he's basically saying, all right, I'll back you up. The decision that the group makes, he will back up. And I think that that's more coherent with what he's saying. Otherwise, it's just a random thing. Like he's talking about how to deal with, people sinning in the group, and all of a sudden he switches gears, and now he's saying, by the way, when you pray, make sure you get more than two or three people together, and then I'll just blanket give you everything you want. That doesn't make sense. So I think he's talking about judgment here. I think he's talking about authority, and he's saying that If the group decides that this is in the best interest of the group, if the group is truly operating in my authority, then this will have my backing. And if it has his backing, can it fail? Should be a pretty easy yes. I mean, no. Spoke wrong there. No, it can't fail. So does that make sense? Does that make sense? But you've got people that will abuse this too. You will have people, and I've seen it, people have been abused by this. Heavy-handed leadership will just kick people out for any reason. And they'll say, well, I've got the Lord's authority, so therefore, da-da-da. Like, that's what I'm saying. There are boundaries here. And boundaries can be transgressed both ways. So we have to be so careful. If we go back to Leviticus 19, when we start to go down this road, we don't have hatred in our heart for our countrymen. If we approach our countrymen and say, you have sinned, it has to be in love. It has to be with the idea of correcting them in a positive way for their betterment, but it has to also be with an eye for protecting the group. And this is where, I think some of the examples we're going to look at here in a minute, I think really illustrate this. Let's go look at Cain. Let's go back to Genesis. Now, Cain obviously sinned. There's some stuff to unpack here. Genesis chapter 4. Let's read the first 16 verses. Genesis 4, 1 through 16. The man had relations with his wife, Eve, and she conceived and gave birth to Cain, and she said, I have gotten a man-child with the help of Yahweh. Again, she gave birth to his brother Abel. Abel was a keeper of flocks, but Cain was a tiller of the ground. So it came about in the course of time that Cain brought an offering to Yahweh of the fruit of the ground. Abel, on his part, also brought of the firstlings of his flock and of their fat portions. Yahweh had regard for Abel and for his offering, but for Cain and his offering, he had no regard. So Cain became very angry, and his countenance fell. We might say Cain was offended. Cain was upset. His feelings were hurt in some way. Okay? He hasn't sinned yet. He hasn't done anything wrong yet, but the situation has him troubled. Then Yahweh said to Cain, why are you angry? Why has your countenance fallen? If you do well, will not your countenance be lifted up? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must master it. So here, Cain has not sinned yet. And Yahweh is doing something that I think he wants us to model. We don't have to wait for our brother to sin to go and say, hey, you messed up, brother. If we can see very obviously that our brother or sister is about to sin, Yahweh sets the tone here. I think we have an obligation to step in and try to counsel them out of it. You're going down a path that you don't need to go down. You're about to do something wrong. Let's talk about it. Because, like I said, either A, they're doing it on purpose, or they're doing it because they don't know better. There aren't any other options. If they don't know any other way, then that's an opportunity for education. If they're doing it on purpose, it's an opportunity for counseling. Why are we doing this wrong thing on purpose? Why are you about to do this, Cain? Because Yahweh knew. Yahweh knew what was in Cain's heart. He knew he wanted to kill Abel. So we have an opportunity there to preemptively, Matthew 18. This is the interesting part. Cain told Abel, his brother. He told Abel. So he has this encounter with Yahweh, and Yahweh's saying, you're upset, Cain. I know you're upset, but if you do better, you'll do fine. But sin is crouching at the door. Like, you're wanting to do something wrong, don't do it. And he goes and tells Abel. Is there any record of there being a conversation with Abel? Like, if somebody came to me and says, the Almighty just came to me and said, hey, I know you're upset, but you're about to do something really bad, don't do it. I would stop what I'm doing and kind of have that conversation. I would think that's kind of important. So I read this and I'm thinking here, what would have changed if Abel would have listened to Cain and they would have had a conversation about this? Would we have ended up with Cain being the first murderer? We'll never know. But I wonder if there could have been more communication between the two of them before the sin took place that maybe would have warded off the sin. And I think that this is an opportunity for us to kind of learn, if we can communicate together in real time as early as possible, we can maybe head some of this stuff off. If somebody is really in a state to where they're really going to transgress and they're really gung-ho about it, if we have an opportunity to talk them down, we shouldn't wait. We shouldn't wait until after they commit the act and then come in and say, okay, now you've done the wrong thing, here's what we have to do. We don't want them to do the wrong thing at all. So let's keep going. So Cain told Abel his brother, and it came about when they were in the field that Cain rose up against Abel his brother and killed him. Then Yahweh said to Cain, where is Abel your brother? He said, I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper? He said, what have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground. Now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. So he has sinned at this point. When you cultivate the ground, it will no longer yield its strength to you. You will be a vagrant and a wanderer on the earth. Cain said to Yahweh, my punishment is too great to bear. Behold, you have driven me this day from the face of the ground, and from your face I will be hidden. I will be a vagrant and a wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me. So Yahweh said to him, therefore, whoever kills Cain, vengeance will be taken on him sevenfold. Yahweh appointed a sign for Cain, so that no one finding him would slay him. Then Cain went out from the presence of Yahweh and settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. So Yahweh has warned Cain, you're about to sin, don't do it. Cain does it anyway. And then now you could say that Yahweh is Matthew 18 in Cain. You sinned. We're going to talk about it. But just like in Matthew 18, what was the end result of the person not reconciling their sin? They're cast out. Cain's cast out here. He's removed from Yahweh's face. So we have an example here of someone who is seemingly unrepentant. He seems remorseful, but being remorseful and being repentant are not necessarily the same thing. Cain doesn't ever say he's wrong. He doesn't say, I'm sorry I did that, I shouldn't have done that. He's just like, oh, they're going to kill me. He's worried about retribution. So if he's allowed to stay with his family, he's going to be a corrupting influence on his family. And of course we see big picture, Cain and his seed were a corrupting influence on humanity on some level. So I think we've got the model here already established that you have to remove people if they are going to intentionally sin and intentionally not repent. It's painful. I have no qualms with saying that this probably broke Yahweh's heart. I don't think Yahweh wanted to do this. As a loving father, no one wants to see their children go through what Cain was going through here. No one wants to see that. But yet Yahweh did. So let's go to Genesis. Let's go to 1 Samuel. We're going to look at a very obvious case here. First Samuel, chapter 12. This is the aftermath of David and Bathsheba. Wait, 1 Samuel 12. Oh, wait, that's not right. I wrote the wrong note. 1 Samuel. It's 2 Samuel. Yeah, there it is. 2 Samuel. 2 Samuel 12, we'll read the first 15 verses. So this is after Uriah has been killed and the whole thing has happened. So we know at this point, just like in Matthew 18, there's no debate, there's no discussion. David has sinned. We don't need to investigate. We don't need to look into it. We know for a fact what happened. Then Yahweh sent Nathan to David, Nathan the prophet, and he came to him and said, there were two men in one city, the one rich and the other poor. The rich man had a great many flocks and herds, but the poor man had nothing except one little ewe lamb, which he had bought and nourished. It grew up together with him and his children. It would eat of his bread and drink of his cup and lie in his bosom, and was like a daughter to him. Now a traveler came to the rich man, and he was unwilling to take him from his own flock for his own hand, to prepare for the wayfarer who had come to him. Rather, he took the poor man's ewe lamb and prepared it for the man who had come to him. So this traveler came to the rich man. The rich man wants to have a meal for the traveler. But instead of taking from his own flocks, he goes to this guy who's got the one ewe lamb that he's just cherishes above all things, and he takes that one. Obviously, this is not a moral good thing to do, right? Then David's anger burned greatly against this man, and he said to Nathan, as Yahweh lives, surely the man who has done this deserves to die. I would say, yeah. He must make restitution for the lamb, fourfold, because he did this thing and had no compassion. Yeah, David's right. Nathan then said to David, you are the man. This is a Matthew 18 thing. This is Nathan going to his brother who has sinned in private and telling him that he sinned. You are the man. Thus says Yahweh Elohim of Israel, it is I who anointed you king over Israel, and it is I who delivered you from the hand of Saul. I also gave you your master's house and your master's wives into your care. I gave you the house of Israel and Judah. And if that had been too little, I would have added to you many more things like these. Why have you despised the word of Yahweh by doing evil in his sight? You have struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword, have taken his wife to be your wife, and have killed him with the sword of the sons of Ammon. Now, therefore, the sword shall never depart from your house, because you have despised me, and have taken the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your wife. So, think about this. We have scriptures that talk about David being a man after Yahweh's own heart. And yet Yahweh here is accusing David of despising him. If Yahweh said, James, you despise me, that's pretty harsh. That's severe. May it never be said that anybody here despises Yahweh, but that's what was said of David. Why? Because David overlooked. David is the king. David is supposed to be the example of Yahweh's authority here on earth. And he is doing this thing that makes Yahweh look bad. Like David was chosen, he was put into place over Saul by Yahweh directly, and everybody knew it. And then he goes and does this? How does that reflect on Yahweh? So David's own actions, regardless of how he felt internally or anything like that, showed that he despised Yahweh. That's a pretty big deal. Thus says Yahweh, verse 11, behold, I will raise up evil against you from your own household. I will even take your wives before your eyes and give them to your companion, and he will lie with your wives in broad daylight. Indeed, you did it secretly, but I will do this thing before all Israel and under the sun. Then David said to Nathan, I have sinned against Yahweh. Nathan said to David, Yahweh also has taken away your sin. You shall not die. However, because by this deed you have given occasion to the enemies of Yahweh to blaspheme, the child also that is born to you shall surely die. So Nathan went to his house. And the last part of it there is really difficult, and that'll be something to discuss maybe at some point. When Yahweh does things like this, where an innocent dies because of something somebody else does. It's a theme that's in our scriptures, and it's a highly relevant theme, but we don't have time to get into it today. But the thing is here, David acknowledges that he sins, but he doesn't say, I've sinned against Uriah. He doesn't say, I've sinned against Bathsheba. He says, I've sinned against Yahweh, which is ultimately true, because he killed a man who was made in Yahweh's image. We don't think about that as often as we should, I think. And he took a woman who was betrothed, more than betrothed, who was actually in covenantal relationship with this man. And David was something about him was broken in a way that he couldn't be satisfied with what he had, so he had to go and pursue more. So there's a fundamental character thing that David's got to work through here, and I think we see as the story unfolds, he actually does work through it. But at this point, David did something really extreme. But he seems to have genuinely repented. It's not like Cain, where there was some remorse, like, oh no, now I'm in trouble, I got busted. Like, no, he's actually genuinely sorrowful for what he did, not because he got caught, but because of the damage that he did. And I think it's interesting here that Nathan tells him on behalf of Yahweh, basically, your sins are forgiven. That's not a New Testament concept. We can go through the Old Testament many times and find people's sins being forgiven. And to me, that's the whole beauty of the Elohim that we serve here. His grace is literally everywhere. Like you can't, I don't want to use the Calvinist term, like inescapable grace or however they describe it, because, there is a limit to it depending on how we behave. But in this case, Yahweh went to David one-on-one through the prophet Nathan. He Matthew 18'd him, and we didn't need to escalate. David took it. David accepted it. There was no need to bring in more people. There was no need to take David before the whole kingdom. It was dealt with, and this is how Matthew 18 is supposed to go. This is the ideal. And hopefully none of us commits a sin so grievous as what David did here. Ours are going to be way more minor. But if the king of Israel himself, think about Nathan. Nathan knows going into this that he could be killed. He may not make it out of that room alive. I mean, they just had however many decades of Saul being king and Saul's craziness. David has the same authority. He's got a different temperament, but he has the same authority. Who's to say that Nathan's not going to get murdered right there in the room? He already killed Uriah. He's already shown that he's willing to kill. But Nathan goes and does it anyway because he sees that if he can turn David from his path, if he can turn him away from this path he's on, then he will win his brother. And that's exactly how we should be. He wasn't going in there to condemn him. He wasn't going in there to judge him per se. He was going in there to correct him. That's what reprove means. That's what rebuke means. It doesn't mean judge. It doesn't mean condemn. It means tell somebody that what they did was wrong with the intent to right, to reconcile, to make things better. So our final example, and this one's got a lot in it. We're going to read Job chapter 23. And you might think, well, how does this fit, James? Very carefully. That's how it fits. It fits very carefully. Job chapter 13. Of course, we know the story of Job. Job is a righteous man. It tells us so. And there's a kind of a challenge. And the challenge is, well, if you take away all your blessing and stop protecting him, then he'll curse you to your face. And Yahweh says, okay, let's test your theory, Satan. Let's see how this works. So Job has everything taken from him except for his life and his wife. You know, people think his wife was taken. No, his wife was allowed to survive. But his children are all gone. His health is gone. His property is gone. Like, he's lost just about everything in a very rapid time. The bottom just fell out. And his three friends are thinking logically. They're thinking like, now, we know, Job, that you look righteous and you do all these great things and you're this wise person, but something like this doesn't happen to somebody unless they did something wrong. That makes logical sense. We can understand how they came to that conclusion. And in our own scriptures, we see where if we sin, there are curses. Leviticus 26 talks about the curses of breaking the covenant. So bad things happen as a judgment for people who sin. It's just a natural thing. And I think that Job's friends are on the right track under normal circumstances in coming to their conclusion, but they don't have all the information. So because they don't have all the information, they come to the wrong conclusion, which Yahweh tells them later at the end of the book. But for the time being, we have a situation where Job is like, look, I'm righteous. I didn't do anything wrong. I don't understand why this is happening to me. So from that perspective, and Job says it, this is not me putting words into Job's mouth. He openly states it. In his opinion, Yahweh has wronged him. Yahweh has transgressed a boundary against Job and punished him for no reason. And so we're going to read here where Job wants to Matthew 18 Yahweh himself. So Job chapter 13. Behold, my eye has seen all this, my ear has heard and understood it. What you know, I also know. I am not inferior to you, but I would speak to the Almighty, and I desire to argue with Elohim. But you smear with lies. You are all worthless physicians. Oh, that you would be completely silent, and that I would become your wisdom, that it would become your wisdom. Please hear my argument and listen to my contentions of my lips. Will you speak what is unjust for Elohim and speak what is deceitful for him? Will you show partiality for him? Will you contend for Elohim? Will it be well when he examines you, or will you deceive him as one who deceives a man? He will surely reprove you if you secretly show partiality. Will not his majesty terrify you and the dread of him fall on you? Your memorable sayings are proverbs of ashes. Your defenses are defenses of clay. Be silent before me so that I may speak. Then let come on me what may. Why should I take my flesh in my teeth and put my life in my hands? Though he slay me, I will hope in him. Nevertheless, I will argue my ways before him. This also will be my salvation, for a godless man may not come before his presence. Listen carefully to my speech, and let my declaration fill your ears. Behold, now I have prepared my case. I know that I will be vindicated. Who will contend with me? For then I will be silent and die. Only two things do not do to me. Then I will not hide from your face. Remove your hand from me, and let not the dread of you terrify me. He's talking about Yahweh. Then call, and I will answer. Or let me speak, then reply to me. How many are my iniquities and sins? Make known to me my rebellion and my sin. Why do you hide your face and consider me your enemy? Will you cause a driven leaf to tremble, or will you pursue the dry chaff? For you write bitter things against me, and make me to inherit the iniquities of my youth. You put my feet in the stocks, and watch all my paths. You set a limit for the soles of my feet, while I am decaying like a rotten thing, like a garment that is moth-eaten. So he's saying here, I don't know what I did wrong, and yet here I am being treated this way. He wants to go to Yahweh. He wants to have a face-to-face audience with Yahweh, and he wants Yahweh to explain to him, okay, Job, here's the unrighteous thing you did. Here's your sin. I think of this as like a two-way Matthew 18, because he's going to Yahweh because he feels Yahweh is wronging him in some level, but he also sees Yahweh as a judge. So he wants to go to Yahweh to have Yahweh basically clarify, from your perspective as a judge, legally, why are you doing this to me? So in some way, he's not looking at Yahweh as sinning, but he is looking at Yahweh as going over a boundary that he doesn't understand why he went over. Why did you come across this boundary and punish me like an unrighteous person when I'm not worthy of that punishment? And we see later at the book, Yahweh says, this isn't about your righteousness or unrighteousness. This is something bigger, Job. You know, like we tend to think of things in terms of us. Yahweh's thinking cosmic scale. He's thinking big picture. But Job doesn't understand that at this point, and Yahweh kind of has to put him in his place. But Job is going to Matthew 18 Yahweh, but with the intention of giving Yahweh the opportunity to Matthew 18 him. This is where I think the sweet spot is. If we're going to Matthew 18 other people, we had better be ready for them to Matthew 18 us. If we don't want somebody to Matthew 18 us, we got no business Matthew 18ing them. And I think Job demonstrates that beautifully here. Because, yes, he demanded an explanation from Yahweh. And I say that word demand knowing that it sounds really, really tough, but that's what he was doing. But he was also demanding that Yahweh judge him righteously. Because from his perspective, he was not being judged right. He wanted to know what was going on. And I don't think there's anything wrong with Job wanting to know what was going wrong, or going on with this. I think he was justified in wanting answers, but I feel like he approached it the best way he could, because his friends weren't really answering anything. They were just telling him things that were obvious. Like, well, you must have really stepped in it, you must have really done something wrong here. And no, I didn't, So he needed something beyond what his friends could give him. But I also think it's interesting in the terms of Matthew 18, this whole Matthew 18 process, the second step, you're supposed to take 2 or 3 people. How many people came to see Job? His 3 buddies. Is there a connection there? Maybe. I don't know. I just think it's interesting. So with Cain, we back up and we have Yahweh giving us a precedent of someone is going to sin. And it's obvious. You can see that train coming and you try to stop them. Okay, that's a righteous and just thing to do. Because if they're allowed to sin, it will be destructive to them. And depending on the nature of the sin, it will be destructive for the whole body, for the whole camp. With David actually did sin. And Nathan goes to him after the fact, in the most literal Matthew 18 way you can imagine, and says, here's the specific thing you did, David. We all know you did it. Now address it and reconcile, which David does. And because David didn't escalate to step 2 or step 3, he was allowed to retain his kingship. He was allowed to retain his authority, and he was allowed to actually bless Israel. If he would have kept going, if he would have dug in his heels and said, I didn't do anything wrong, I'm the king, he would have been cut off, just like Saul was. Just because David's David doesn't mean he's so special that he can't be removed like Saul was. Saul was anointed by Yahweh. Saul didn't just wake up one day and say, you know what, I'm the tallest guy in the tribe of Benjamin, I'm going to be the king. Like, no, Yahweh actually selected him. So he can unselect someone just as soon as he can select them. Anyway, so when we get into Matthew 18, I think, and I'll just wrap it up with this because I think this is a basic point to make, but I think it's a foundationally important point to make. When we go up the escalation ladder from personal offense, hurt feelings, things like that, those are the things, there is no sin. No harm has actually been happening. There's nothing wrong been done per se. There's a perception of it for sure, because people don't get offended unless they perceive a wrong against them. But our perceptions are not always accurate. So when I perceive that someone has wronged me in some way, and it has caused me to be upset, or has caused me to be hurt, whatever it is, I need to figure out, am I understanding it correctly? So like, if they are legitimately angry at me, I need to know why. Because either A, I did something worthy of that anger, maybe I sinned and didn't know it. And by having that conversation, we can figure that out. And I can avoid the Matthew 18 altogether because I've identified the sin myself. That's the ideal. But we don't get that unless we talk about it as we go. If we just I use this as an example sometimes. A few years ago, I made an offhand comment around a dinner table. And I found out months later that a family was just grievously offended by it, and they had held this grudge, and it's like, we were all at the table. You could have told me that in real time, and we could have talked through it, and I could have explained what I was saying in more detail. But that never happened. I had no idea, you know? And so like in that case, you know, it's something that could have been, you know, the fallout from that could have been avoided by just talking. And I think that most of the time, if we can hit it at that level, we never get to Matthew 18. Because we're able to work through and we're able to mentor each other peer-to-peer. And I think the peer-to-peer is important too, because, and this is where different people have different interpretations of headship and things like that. But when he uses the term brother, when your brother sins, I do think it's important to have some degree of peerness. So like adult to adult, you know, like if an adult sees a child do something, you go to that child's parents, you know. When you start to get into headship, I think just to keep things on the up and up and keep things neat and tidy, if a man sins, another man needs to go to him. I don't know that we should have a man going to another man's wife and saying, hey, here's the wrong thing you did, without involving the husband. You know, I think that there are things like that to consider. But generally speaking, if we can just talk through stuff in real time and realize that usually it's misunderstandings, these offenses that we have, then we keep the overall pressure in the pressure cooker down. We're not getting so worked up because we know from Cain, anger leads to sin. That's expressed over and over. If we can keep ourselves from getting worked up, we're less likely to sin against each other. And so we avoid Matthew 18 altogether, I think, if we're able to actually cultivate a process and a habit of behaving that way. We're not there. I'm not there. I was in a discipleship group a couple years ago, and we talked about this a lot. And one of our big motto was, grow a spine. Grow a spine. Like, that sounds tough and macho, like, just be a man, man up. That's not what we mean. We mean be firm when you need to be firm. Because sometimes you have to rebuke your neighbor. Sometimes you have to go to your neighbor and say, hey, man, what are you doing? No, that's not cool. That's justified. And by not doing that, we allow sin to grow. We allow sin to fester. And we've got young ones watching the adults. And I've had conversations with young people over the years that have expressed they see the adults not doing this, and they see the outcomes of it, and they don't want anything to do with this. They go looking for places, wherever they may be, other churches, out in the world, whatever it is, or they go into their own little personal private Idahos, and they try to find places where they can actually have some accountability or they can have some kind of communication because they don't see it happening with the parents. So we as the older generation have an opportunity here to really learn how to do this And at the risk of sounding trite, he never promised us a rose garden, right? I beg your pardon, he never promised us, he never did. This is not, that we were never told this walk was going to be easy. And if you look at the wilderness journey for 40 years, a bunch of bickering, moaning, and complaining and rebellion. And years and years ago, we were at the feast, we were doing tabernacles, and somebody was like, this is so hard, and I'm just so down because I just wanted to rejoice. And it's like, this is supposed to remind us of our time in the wilderness. Read those chapters in the Bible about what the wilderness was like. You're dealing with people all the time. People are in your space. People are, kids are probably arguing and fighting and stuff, and the parents have to get involved, and you've got all this mess going around all the time. You have to be able to work through that, or it will destroy the body. And I think with Israel, we see collectively decade after decade, century after century of sin not being dealt with, sin being allowed to go. There's no accountability, there's no discussion. It destroyed ancient Israel. They were cast out. Matthew 18, right? When the whole assembly hears the matter and it's still not dealt with, the offender gets cast out from before Yahweh's face, like with Cain. That's exactly what happened to our forefathers. Yahweh sent the prophets day in, day out to Matthew 18 us, and we didn't listen. And so we got cast out. And now we're in a situation to where we have to be grafted back in. We should have never been cut off from the tree, but yet here we are. So we have an opportunity. And those who were in leadership over the different fellowships have a higher standard of accountability. Like, no one should be in this. This is where I see out in the wider world, there's so much abuse. Those who are in leadership, regardless of what that looks like, cannot be above this. Matthew 18 should apply to leadership first, 100% of the time. 100%. Because leadership directs the congregation, directs the assembly generally. And if leadership is allowed to sin, and if leadership is allowed to do things that are unaccountable, that will spread. That sets the tone for the whole group. Your group will fail. We see that all through the Bible. We see Paul calling people out, naming names. He's addressing sin at the different assemblies. You guys allow that? You guys are allowed, like seriously? Because they're not dealing with it in real time. And so Paul's having to write these letters to people to basically say, look, you guys need to deal with this, because they weren't dealing with it. If Corinth and Philippi and all these different places, if they were dealing with everything in real time, Matthew 18 and talking things through, Paul wouldn't have had to write the letters that he did, or at least the way he did. And the tone might have been a lot more, hey guys, good job, you're doing great, instead of you foolish Galatians, Paul's stress level probably would have come down a little bit if we could have just talked back then. And I think it's the same now. So I will close it with that. Hopefully that was something useful. And like I said, this is something that is painful. Having someone come to you and tell you that what you're doing is wrong doesn't make you feel good. It's not supposed to. It's supposed to make you think. And if you have a true dialogue with that person, and I learned this recently, the word dialogue comes from the Greek word dialogos. Makes sense, right? But it has to do with the idea of you're not debating. You're not debating trying to prove somebody wrong and prove your case. That's not dialogue. True dialogue is two people engaging in logos, word. And logos is creative. The idea of a true dialogue is you are creating something new through conversation. You are learning something new together that you didn't know before as a result of that conversation. And I think if we think of Matthew 18 as dialogos, both parties, when confronted with sin, have the opportunity to learn about the nature of sin. They have an opportunity to identify it in themselves, and they have an opportunity to learn how to communicate where they can dialogos with other people in the camp. So if we want to remove sin from the camp, A, do your best not to sin. B, when someone inevitably does, we have to go through this. And if the person is not willing to repent, that's their problem. And yes, it's a bummer. It stinks. Most of the people here in this room have probably had an experience in a fellowship at some time over the years where somebody had to be put out for some reason. We've had to do that before. And it took us, I think, 2 years to go through it because we didn't want to. We didn't want to. When you love somebody, when you're attached to somebody, you do not want to put them out of the fellowship. But sometimes you have to. And so this is just something to think about. We all need to grow a spine. Even you ladies. Ladies can grow spines too. Now, some ladies might have some really tough spines. There are some of those out there. That's cool. My mom is one of them. My mom's got a spine of steel. And it's a good thing, I think, most of the time. Anyway, so I'll close it at that. Hopefully that was beneficial and helpful. And at this point, we'll open the floor for questions, comments, and strong opinions that are relative to the teaching. I have to throw that caveat in there. That are relevant to the teaching.